introduce Oleksandra Poquet. She's live from Australia. I have no idea what time it is there, but we very much appreciate her being able to do this. And her talk is Social Architectures of University Forums, Grade-Based Similarity in Online Interactions. And she currently works at the Center for Change and Complexity in Learning at the University of South Australia. And her research focuses on designing, understanding, and measuring peer effects in digital settings. So thank you very much. And we're looking forward to your talk.
Hi, Catherine. Thank you so much for this introduction. Yes, it is early morning in Australia, and I'm delighted to be talking a little bit about my work. I'm new to NetSciEd, I'm new to this community, and I'll say a few words about why I thought to send it a piece of work, but I'll get to that. So I'll be talking about the work I've done together with colleagues from the University of Michigan and National University of Singapore. And I'm located in Australia, in Adelaide, and Adelaide is not Sydney. For those of you who have never been to Australia or haven't seen it, it was a shock to me to know that the distances are here pretty far away. So I'm about 1,400 kilometers away from Sydney, and we're moving into a beautiful time of the year. Now, one of the reasons why I thought to join your group and see what kind of research people do is that my work is situated within the area of learning analytics, and we have a special issue on networks in learning analytics coming up end of December. And this is an open access journal by the Society of Learning Analytics and Research. It's an academic society that looks at how we can understand and inform learning using data collected online combined with other things. And I am aware that a lot of pockets of people are doing this kind of work in other places. So I just thought to mention that. And if you have any more questions, please, I'll have my email at the end, and please feel free to reach out. The work that I'm describing is closely related to my research interests. So I've been studying how people interact and learn online in online spaces. And it's a little bit different from what you see on the internet, and it's a little bit different from what you'd see in social networks, because there's a learning design element that comes in, and there are forces that drive the formation of these social structures in digital spaces. And as I have learned through my work, it's a little bit non-trivial to understand what's actually happening. So this was the first really large-scale attempt to that. But to give some context, we know now that everybody's been sort of forced online. Everybody can relate to this thing that the lack of peer interactions in learning is painful to learners, is painful to instructors. And if you look at the recent evidence coming out from these large-scale surveys that's been implemented, there's a lot of support that demonstrates that. People who worked in education and digital learning specifically, that's not surprising, because peer interactions is the key mechanism for learning. And in settings such as university settings, interactions are also related with other outcomes such as retention, employability, well-being. But in online spaces, when we think of designing these programs for students, right? As an instructor, you support your students through class activities, and that's sort of, there's a whole line of work associated with that. So we know how to facilitate social interactions in class, and we have some understanding of what's happening there. Then there's another strand of literature that talks about relationships between people in learning settings and how that affects learner change. But what is very little of is what happens in between these spaces, so to speak. So we know what happens in the class, and we know what happens at a large scale much later. But if you are an administrator or a program course coordinator that coordinates several modules, you need to sort of figure out how to facilitate these interactions across different courses, so that then the students receive the cohort level experience, if you like, or the program level experience. And so this was the motivation for this study. We're looking at large-scale data from 3 universities to see what's happening to inform our future efforts to sort of start thinking, well, how do you facilitate a social experience online across courses in a cohort so that the outcomes, the student outcomes, come through much later at later periods of time. If I get the time to speak at the end about how this study came to be practically, it's a little bit of a story, but at the end of the day, we were able to run the same time of analysis on the data from 3 universities, which was non-trivial. So going through the ethics, making sure that the data sets were comparable, that the variables we were looking at were similar. We were not allowed to analyze each other's data due to basically ethical nature of learner data. So researchers at different universities had to be looking at the data. I was affiliated with 2 universities, so that made it somewhat easier, but still. 3 universities, so the learning management systems, you all, again, I'm sorry for making assumptions, but if you work at the university, you teach courses in some kind of learning management system. So Blackboard is the one that everybody knows about, Canvas, these kind of systems collect this data that we've analyzed. So that's the kind of data we looked at. And all the 3 universities have different learning management systems. So the only limitation on a cohort level that we've done was that we looked at people who started in the same year, and then we looked only at their interactions going forward. So it wasn't all interactions by all students in all 4 years, but all interactions by all students who started it at the same time. So it was a cohort-based analysis. And the questions we asked were around the homophily in performance. So what I mean by performance is that we looked at students' grades and we averaged that across the semester or across the year, depending on where they were. I personally think that performance or grades is the least interesting thing to look at, but that's how historically this happened. So that was enough trouble on its own. So the questions we asked were, how similar was the performance of students who interact in online university forums over the course of the study? We also wanted to know how much of it is social selection and how much of it is influence, whatever we could tease out, and then what could be the implications observed from the patterns that we see. I'm not going to spend much time on the methods, but at the very high level, what we've done was we looked at the data descriptively. So we looked at the descriptions of ties and took some ego network focus. And then we built models that captured the relationship between the network formation and the grade change. But I'll say a few words because the networks that we ran the models on were different from the large scale cohort-based networks. There were reasons for that. Another non-trivial, well, for me, it was a non-trivial choice, but we spent a lot of time thinking, how should we construct our networks? And so the networks were constructed at the discussion level and at the level of the post, which basically means if all of us have made posts in a discussion thread, we build networks of posts, and we only maintain the links between the posts that were under a threshold that was an average across a time period. And then based on that, we made a projection, a learner-learner projection of relationships or interactions, if you like, between students. The caveat of what happens when you build networks online over a large period of times is that the data is extremely sparse, which makes longitudinal analyses of networks that are not time varying, that don't take time in modeling explicitly, challenging, I'd say that. So the interaction networks or the data that represented all interaction, all communication activity of students, that was relatively easy to construct those networks and to look at the sort of the descriptive patterns within them. But to model change in them was difficult because in order to understand selection or influence, we had to presume that there were relationships in place, which basically means that just because you and I had an interaction and discussion thread doesn't mean that that's actually in a relationship that can impact my performance, or that can impact some attitude change, which you all are situated in educational space. You know that to what extent that holds. So in order to both make the relationship argument hold and be able to model longitudinal change, we looked at how often do two people talk across years. So if an interaction holds for longer than one period of time, it would be kept. And so that apparently at university level within that data is extremely rare. So most students do not talk to one another online more often than within a period of a semester or a year, depending on the institution we looked at. Which meant that those networks that were more representative of relationships were rather small and a really small subset of the larger data set. And I still have reservations as to what extent this small subset is representative of a larger whole. We can't know. It's kind of difficult to make that interpretation. Another thing worth noting, because I'll talk about the results in a bit, and this is worth noting, is that the grade distributions, so the performance overall within the 3 universities was different. One of these universities had a bell-shaped grade distribution, which means there was a lot of different people of different performance, and that kind of stayed similar across the years. Well, another 2 universities had more high-performing students in general, and that shifted to be even more extreme as they were going through the 4 years. In other words, you have universities with a lot of really ambitious and high-performing students who try to do better, and that shows in the distribution, which will show in the effects. And that is also another reason why we looked at the slightly different time periods within the 3 universities, because one of those universities had programs that students can engage with more flexibly. So it made sense from the perspective of the data, once you start wrangling and comparing, to look at the semester length rather than a year length for one of them. All right, so what we found was that, I'll say a few words about the plot. So what this plot tells you is that in year 1, the ties that were of frequency 1, we had 1,877 of them. And then on average, the difference between the performance of I and J within each pair was a little bit over one stand. So what's this? This is a normalized rank. So they were within 1 point in ranking. Long story short, what you observe in the data is that the difference between the students' grades on average between the 2 people in a dyad is roughly within 1 grade or less. And that holds across all the, I mean, this is just one slide, but it would be the same for other universities. It's just that the sort of the size of the standard deviation would differ. So sometimes it's half a grade, sometimes it's more than that. But it's always small. The difference was no more than about 1.2, 1.3, more likely like 0.5, 0.6 between the 2 people. So the performance within a dyad was similar. And when you look at the differences within the ego network, so what this slide shows just takes data from ego networks at a first-year student. So student whose performance is ranked in the bottom 25% would have most of the people that they would talk to would be of the same performance. So what this shows is that who they talk to is varied, but it's largely people of the same rank. And we chose to deal with ranks because the grades were distributed in a way that sort of showed the pattern more prominently. We felt that that was capturing and making generalization between the data set. It was a more appropriate choice. And so when we modeled these smaller networks, I have the outcomes here on the side, is that we've seen selection in small networks in all 3 universities. Now, small networks where each interaction lasted 2 to 3 years, right? So it's likely that we can say that these people in fact knew each other. And so this effect can happen in reality. So we see that there is selection, but and selection mostly describes the network homophily, but we also see some things like this here in the 3rd university, where if you just look at the selection at the level of the population, it's negative. But if you start modeling specifically the marginal interaction, so it's happening what's sort of fixing selection only at the top 25% of the students in performance, then you see selection processes. So the way I interpret it is that if you look at everybody, they are being diverse in their interactions. But if you only look at top performers, they actually tend to self-select a lot more. If you look at the bottom performers, they tend to self-select a lot more. And that happens in the universities where you have this skew going on in their performance going forward. There is not much influence in these small networks. But there are 2 things worth noting. One was that the performance over time was likely to change if you already had it at a certain level, meaning that if you were a D student in year 1, you weren't likely to change your performance. But if you were a B or a C, you were a lot more likely to change. And that is important because the influence basically was observed, and I don't have the plots here for the specific interactions between the different grade levels, but the what we observed was basically if you are, let's say, if you're already at a particular level of a performance, so if you're a B or C, you can potentially change, and the effect would be stronger for somebody who's just a little bit better than you, which sort of speaks back to this descriptive diagram, right? So you do have people at the lower part of the performance, they are unlikely to change due to peer effects. But if you're somewhere in the middle, you can change, and the effect will be coming from people who are just above where you sit. Well, that's how I read these findings. Now, I spoke for 17 minutes. There are a lot of limitations as to what this study tells us, and the limitations are all over the place, meaning that it's hard to make sort of unnegotiable claims about some of the things we've observed, but I think the patterns are interesting. We need a lot more better models than the ones we've used, but that was a starting point because these models are really not working very well with the data, with the nature of digital data and scaled at the program level. But I think what we've seen in the pattern is that there is this balance between diversity and similarity, and that impacts the learner change. And so understanding better what that looks like and what that looks like temporally as it unfolds in a much more granular scale is of interest to me. So I think that sort of comes from this work. Future pieces of work related to that involve working on better data sets, different approaches to modeling, but also understanding why we observe these homophily. So one of the things I'm working on right now is building new models to see what's driving these patterns. Is that, to what extent is it the enrollment in the course pattern? To what extent is just the distribution of learners? To what extent is the timing? Because we build networks built on time, or built on co-occurrence within a particular time window, and things like that. So that would be the end. I think I have 2 minutes for questions. I'd appreciate questions. And I would like to, again, say that if you are doing work in this area and you think that you would like to publish it in an open access academic thing, we have this special issue. So please consider that. Thank you.
Give our speaker a round of applause. Thank you, Sasha. And we do have time for a question or two. Are there questions?
Yes, I have a question.
Hiroki, yes.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sasha. This is very interesting work. So it's very interesting to see the directionality of effects from A to B and B to C, but not the vice versa. So is there anything that we can actually do to utilize that kind of asymmetric influence to potentially lift up the bottom students?
So again, I'm only going to speculate, right? Because I said I have a lot of reservations as to how much we can actually generalize. My sense is that we don't see the effect for the students at the very bottom, is because they are not. So this is from educational science research, and it's more like they need a teacher. They don't need peers. There may be gaps in their knowledge that are not, they're not yet ready to enter the knowledge construction stage where their motivation and the knowledge of others can lift them up to a better place. But they may have more significant gaps in what they know. So tutoring or sort of more scaffolded work will bring them to a level up where then they can take it in their own hands, if you like. So that's how I understand it. And I also think that we don't see anything happening with the top students, but that's just based on other work. And my own view on that is that educational science kind of wants to look at the middle ground and have everybody bring up, but nobody looks at the development of the top performer. Like, how do you push the top performer to be the toppest, right? Because there's no limit. So we're like, okay, well, they're doing well already. They'll be fine. So we're not looking at what's happening there either. But the understanding of why the bottom student doesn't get lifted, to me, is because their needs are different. And to me, that's probably an important implication of this, is that if you build a system right online, you want to match students. Well, maybe it's not such a great idea to match students who are struggling with students who are better, because some of them may not benefit from that kind of matching at all.
Yeah, makes sense. Thank you very much.
Thank you. One more quick question. Massimo, yes.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sasha. It was a really nice talk, and thank you also for your availability with the time zone and everything. When you mentioned that for one university there was grades on a bell, it rang with me because in the UK, some universities from the Russell Group, they actually impose for lecturers to grade on a bell, so that even though the original distribution of scores didn't look like a Gaussian curve, the lecturers were forced to actually make the grades like that. And did you find also in that specific university that there was not such a thing like this sort of lifting effect? And how was the presence of these outliers, exceptional students in other two universities create differences against like this third university on a grade?
So I actually think that the bell curve that we observe here, although it may be to some extent an artifact of what instructors do, represents the more egalitarian and diverse nature of the student population. I think it's actually a true bell curve, if you like, because we see a lot more natural effects happening within that university. So we see things like there is selection and there is influence. And when you start looking down into the data, it's also analyzed on smaller scales, right? Because it's semesters, flexible pathways. So it's a lot more stuff is happening there, I think, or at least it's easier to see. And I think it is because we have a true diversity of performance. While in the other two universities, I mean, when we're building the models, I mean, how can you have no social selection? It's impossible. I mean, it really surprised me. And so once you think about this and you start looking, well, it's just because the population is not as diverse, you have to think, okay, but where are they selecting? Because you just can't see that. Or at least, I mean, maybe I'm just convincing myself of the wrong hypothesis possible, right? And I truly believe that they must self-select, so I'm looking for it, possibly. But I think it has to do with the culture. So the universities have different culture and different things are happening. And again, if you see social selection at the top, 25%, I think it sort of, again, speaks back to that speculation where I say, well, the top performers need their own development if they're the very, very top. So that's where they seek in their own development by doing these sort of more intense interactions. But, and so, for instance, triadic closure, social selections, triadic closure for top performers is positive within these universities on the sort of where you have a lot more high performing students. I'm not sure it answered your question, but.
Yeah, no, I think you mentioned also very interesting examples. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sasha.